Civil disobedience. People reshaping laws. Over the course of time, many people and events helped shape the justice system into what people today know. Many of the changes were brought on by ordinary men and women who fought against unjust laws, even though this means at the time that they were breaking the law. These people stood up for what was morally right, thus holding the government to the words of the Declaration of Independence. People to recognize in this category is Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks. After the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution were supposed to guarantee equal rights for African Americans. But in the South, segregation of the races, the denial of opportunities of African American, and their disfranchisement continued in a system known as Jim Crow law. In 1896, in a controversial decision, the United States Supreme Court in the case Plessy v. Virginia upheld the separate but equal facilities for the races. On June 7, 1892, 30-year-old Homer Plessy was jailed for sitting in the white car of East Louisiana Railroad. Plessy held easily passed for a white man, but under Louisiana law he was considered to be black regardless of his light complexion, and for that reason he was required to sit in the colored car. When Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, legally segregating common carriers in 1892, a black civil rights organization decided to challenge the law in the courts. Plessy intentionally sat in the white section and identified himself as being black. He was arrested and the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Plessy's lawyer argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th and 14th Amendment of the Constitution. In 1896, the Supreme Court of the United States heard the case and held the Louisiana segregation statute constitutional. Speaking for the seven-man majority, Justice Henry Brown wrote, "A statute which implies merely a legal distinction between the white and colored races has no tendency to destroy the legal equality of two races. The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things it could not have been intended to abolish distinction based upon color or to enforce social and distinction from political equality as a companion of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory. The entire Justice John Harlan saw the horrific consequence of the decision. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Any respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The present decision, it may well be apprehended, will not only simulate aggression more or less brutal and irritating upon the admitted rights of the colored citizens, but will encourage the belief that it is possible, by means of state enactments, to defeat the benefaction's purpose which the people of the United States had in enactments. When their adoption, the reaction and amendment of the Constitution. The Plessy decision set the example that separate facilities for blacks and whites were constitutional as long as they were equal. The separate but equal doctrine was quickly extended to cover many areas of the public life, such as restaurants, theaters, restrooms, and public schools. It wasn't until 1954 that Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka would the separate but equal doctrine be struck down. During World War II, President Roosevelt outlawed discrimination in the military. As the country fought for freedom around the world, many African Americans began to wonder why they didn't deserve the same rights of freedom outside of the military. In 1954, a series of landmark cases testing segregation that were pressed by the National Association for the Advance of Colored People ended in the Supreme Court's ruling in the Brown versus Board of Education case, which unanimously outlawed segregation of public schools. On December 1st, 1955, the modern civil rights movement began when Rosa Parks, an African American woman, was arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her act sparked a citywide boycott of the bus system by blacks and lasted more than a year. Rosa Parks stated in an interview, "I was arrested on December 1st, 1955 for refusing to stand up on the orders of the bus driver after white seats had been occupied in the front, and of course I was not in the front of the bus as many people have written and spoken that I was. That I got on the bus and took the front seat, but I did not. I took a seat that was just back where the white people were sitting, in fact, the last seat. A man was next to the window, and I took an aisle seat, and there were two women across. We went on undisturbed until about the second or third stop, when some white people boarded the bus and left one man standing. And when the driver noticed him standing, he told us to stand up and let him have those seats. He referred to them as front seats, and when the other three people, after some hesitancy, stood up, he wanted to know if I was going to stand up, and I told him I was not. And he told me he would have me arrested, and I told him he may do that. And of course, he did." Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks organized a bus boycott, which eventually led to the desegregation of the bus line and launched protests across the South. In 1960, spontaneous sit-ins by students began at lunch counters throughout the South. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist preacher. He quickly rose to the forefront of the civil rights movement. He was a symbol for nonviolence to the world, and he also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. He was influenced by Gandhi. On March 4, 1961, a group of 13 African American and white civil rights activists launched the Freedom Riders, a series of bus trips through the American South to protest segregation in interstate bus terminals. The Freedom Riders, who were recruited by the Congress of Racial Equality, a U.S. civil rights group, departed from Washington, D.C. and attempted to integrate facilities at bus terminals along the way into the Deep South. African American Freedom Riders tried to use white-only restrooms and lunch counters, and vice versa. Bonton versus Virginia expanded a ban on segregation on interstate buses, included bus stations, waiting rooms, and restaurants that served interstate travels. Even with the protests being nonviolent, the group encountered tremendous violence from white protesters along the route, but also drew international attention to their cause. Over the next few months, several hundred Freedom Riders engaged in similar actions. In September 1961, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting segregation in buses and train stations nationwide. In 1963, television viewers saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans and whites march on Washington, D.C. to end racial discrimination. It was there that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous speech, I Have a Dream. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations and schools, with also removing obstacles to voting. As parts of the Civil Rights Act, the federal government would withhold funds from any state that did not dis- desegregate. In 1967, John Gardner threatened to cut off $95.8 million in federal welfare funds to the state of Alabama unless it complied with desegregation guidelines. Today, the push for civil rights continues, not only with African American issues, but also other discriminated groups were inspired by civil rights movements. Over the 1960s and 1970s, gays and lesbians, women, Native Americans, and people with disabilities pushed for their own presence in American society. And as the presentation has shown, there have always been laws that people have found unjust, whether it be right to vote or racial prejudice, and people took a stand for what they believed was right. And truth standing against what people find unjust is the origin of the United States of America. Americans have been fighting injustice since before they gained their title, and this may very well continue in the future, not just in America, but in every country on earth.